But I mean, talking about the strategy of focus protection, has that been done anywhere in the world that you can see effectively?
I think you'll find that a lot of Asia, it is effectively the strategy.
Right.
And Asia, I think, came into it with a number of advantages, but the obvious one of which, the experience from SARS-1 and MERS. In Japan and a lot of Asia, well, I think their elderly population is probably more healthy. It's more elderly. I mean, they have some of the highest longevity in the world, so we can't argue that we had an older population than Japan. But I think they're kind of they're probably more healthy, and their mode of looking after the elderly is probably better. But the way they dealt with serious cases coming into hospitals, the case that required, was from day one 1,000,000 times better, and they were seeing almost no hospital-acquired infections. You went in if you were suspected, and I'm sure this was learning from SARS and MERS. But if you went in to an Asian hospital and with suspected symptoms, you never saw anybody who wasn't in protection. You never got the chance to mingle with any other patients on any other type of wards. None of the doctors or medical staff that treated you would ever cross-contaminate to any other type of wards from day one. And I think that's broadly the crux of it.
Well, there's the rub, really, because I mean, we're going to continue to go into lockdown if we believe that our goal in as a society, our main goal is to protect the NHS, and the NHS has I think over the last 10 years has had sort of lost funding effectively, and we lost, I think, 5,000 beds from last year. So we're not in a good place to meet the winter. And I'm sort of thinking, what do you see if we do put restrictions in this winter or even in the new year? Will to try and save the NHS? Will the economy recover?
I think the economy will recover eventually, and eventually will come out of these restrictions. Right. The longer the restrictions go on, the more lives you ruin on the way through.
Your industry, do you think?
Look, a lot of places in hospitality have already closed, and jobs have been lost, and people gone out of business, and individual lives have been ruined.
So it depends what you mean by recovery.
It depends what you mean by recovery. Those businesses will not recover. But I think just briefly going back to Japan, population 130 million people. 10 of the most crowded, most populated cities in the entire world are in Japan, and far fewer restrictive measures than here. Managed to hold the Olympics, albeit I know on a slightly cut down fashion, but no real lockdowns, and incredibly low number of deaths compared to anywhere in Europe. And if I'd been in government, I'd have, from the beginning of the first wave, I'd have said, for God's sake, what's going on in Japan? 10 of you, get over there. Don't come back until you figure out why they've got...
Is it that they're more digitised? Is that perhaps...
There's lots of potential reasons.
We don't know,
but I say, go out there, just don't call unless you figure out how they've done that, rather than, a set of failed responses copied around Europe. And if you look around Europe, the people that had fewer deaths to start with are all catching up, and the people who had more deaths to start with are now slipping back. And everywhere in the whole of Central Europe that's with the similar sort of population level is going to end up in roughly the same place. And all the measures, all the MPIs, all the lockdowns, all the things will have made not a blind bit of difference, because we're all going to end up in the same place. And if you look now at UK and Spain, and by the time you allow for the fact that none of the counting is accurate within 10-15%, Germany's catching up. So I'm going, no.
Yeah, they're in there.
All the places in Europe with similar population levels, that we're all roughly going to end up in the same place. All the measures, complete waste of time. Yeah. None of them worked, and they delayed it a bit here, they did a bit there, and
but there's no correlation between imposition of lockdown and falls in hospitalizations and deaths. Actually, they don't always match.
No, they don't match at all. Look at Peru. I mean, for God's sake, hideous, horrible lockdown really from the start. So But, you know, the governments have kind of run around, they've been seen to act, they've been, but yeah, I mean, when everyone ends up in roughly the same place, you hope that they'll wake up one day and say, oh, hang on, what was the point of all that then?
Yeah. No one's actually trialled the NPIs, looked at the non-pharmaceutical interventions really properly and trialled those. They just carry on using them.
If you think of the demands that are made on a drug company, quite reasonably, by the way, for trials of any kind of medical treatment where you have to have a random controlled trial, you know, the gold standard trial, you have to have a group, you know, a group here and, you know, on placebo and a group over there, and you have to demonstrate efficacy absolutely beyond doubt and safety even more beyond doubt. And you take all these NPIs, which are far more damaging than many of these drugs that go through this. No such trials done, no evidence that any of them were. Oh yeah, we'll just give it a go because it kind of feels like they might.
People argue they're not damaging, but I think we've touched on that. Masks, you know, neurodiverse, people who are deaf, our social structure, social distancing, damaging to the economy, damaging to people's mental health and well-being. I mean, that's the argument, isn't it? It's just a mask, it's just distancing, it's just these things.
50,000 of the most deprived children just disappeared off the register. 50,
is it 100,000, I think?
100,000. Well, I saw it was 130,000 and it was 50,000 paper. But certainly 50,000 acknowledged by social services to have just disappeared.
Yeah, and a lot of
50,000 children.
Yeah, gone. And a lot of people warned that there would be deaths. And I think I was speaking to a professor that worked with, you know, in some of the early meetings recently, and they said, how many deaths of children do you expect? And they couldn't predict that, but the modelers could predict with some, I don't know whether, you know, how many deaths from the virus. So I think that was the focus. The modelers did a lot of modelling around the virus and the R number, but the collateral damage wasn't built in, was it? It wasn't really modelled.
No, and
nebulous.
I think, you know, there was a very big study. It was over the first full year of COVID, you know, conducted by, I think, led by the ex-chair of the Royal Society of Paediatrics, and you know, from a number of, you know, the UK's most eminent paediatricians who have devoted their lives to saving children, by the way. So while people could level criticism at me because I'm in hospitality, you know, that's been their entire career, saving children. And that study found that, I think the number was 9, they could only identify 9 children that had actually died from COVID over that first year, 9 children, young people under 18s. While over the same period, 3,156, I think it was, 3,150 anyway, had died from other causes, all other causes. So 9 deaths with that.
Not excess, but just
3,000. So firstly, it's 9 versus 3,000.
So
and then, and as against that, you've got 50,000 or 100,000 of the most deprived children in society vanished off social services, some of whom will unquestionably end up in situations from which they will either die or have you know, serious life impairment for the whole of their lives.
Yeah.
And this is the proportionality that we need to look at. First, 9 versus 3,000, but 9 versus 100,000 here, damage to the education of the entire under 18 cohort. Yeah. And it's this balance that at no point
has anyone looked at or been seen to been apparent. I think Deliveroo drivers were doing checks during the first and second lockdown to check for abuse because they spotted it when they were delivering. I mean, Deliveroo drivers aren't trained social workers, but isn't that a poor state that we've got? We've had, you know, the death of Arthur and some other high-profile deaths in lockdown, and I think there was an early signal of head injuries in I think it was one of the London hospitals being seen at quite significantly increased rates. So we saw it early on. It's not like we didn't have any signs, and probably more may come out. So I think
and schools are, you know, schools are for a lot of these children, they are the only anchor. I mean, they're the anchor for normal children in lots of ways, but you know, for the most deprived of them, for lots of them turning up at school most days is one of the few anchors in very unstable lives, and it's the place where they are seeing people who, by definition, care about them, and there is a decent chance that issues can get spotted, you know, and talked through. And it's one of the few interactions. If you close schools for those people, I know they weren't supposed to be, but it's certainly. It was at least, I think that was the number of like 130,000 the most deprived were not attending the schools, as against the 50,000 were the ones that had dropped off the register, I think. And you know, that's 100,000+ but where school was possibly the only place where any serious issues would get
So
spotted.
do you think then we could sort of reform SAGE or the advisors to have psychologists, educationalists, economists, people from the hospitality industry, put all of these people on SAGE to advise the government so that we have a built-in mechanism to perhaps reflect all of these things, because you can't necessarily expect a modeller to be building that into his model because it's not his bag, he will do maths. I mean, how else do we get round this? Because we seem to be going round in circles, don't we? We're back down again, facing restrictions, facing another winter in lockdown or a new year in lockdown, and we don't seem to be measuring the harm. So how do we flip out of it? I mean, there's no exit plan. There's no other.
I think it's exactly right that in terms of the recommendations to government, a lot of them, certainly for most of the period, and all the ones from SAGE seem to be free of advice on the other areas that were impacted. The mental health of children, the effect on the economy, the effect on business, the effect on hospitality, the effect on individuals, the effect on education. It seemed to be very, very narrow.
Yeah,
and so. Certainly, before the advice is given to government, those other clearly affected parties should have had input. And if you added all those up, there's absolutely no question that the damage far outweighed the good of those MPRs. The second thing, though, that I think is even more strange is that epidemiology, mathematical modelling is a very small part of epidemiology that's only really gained traction. It's not at all really what epidemiology is about.
But we've used a lot of modelling. I mean, I know there's been critics of the current pandemic policy to have overused modelling, and it sort of has an answer, doesn't it? When you don't really know what you're doing and the modellers can say, look, if you do this, this will happen according to our models. It's a quick...
But it fundamentally doesn't work. It's useful as a very small part of epidemiology,
right?
But models, and
you've worked with models.
I've looked at models. Extent that, I spent actually sort of 10 years. And another business that effectively created was a very large consolidator of life insurance.
Oh, right.
In fact, it's the largest in Europe, and so we have millions of customers who are annuitants, who are retired people, getting paid pensions. So you spend... When we first inherited the business, they had 450,000 spreadsheets, to give you an idea, when we went through, which is not a good way to run a business, by the way. So you spend a lot of time in terms of modelling, and so you get very good knowledge, and life expectancy is absolutely critical, which is one of the reasons I know a lot about who's actually died from COVID as opposed to who people tell you has died. And, models that predict the future are wrong. I mean, they're just wrong, basically. They're like a stop clock. There will be, if you take 1,000 models, one will be close. But there's no other thing that. They'll be, they will be right by randomness.
Why are they useful then? Why do we use them?
They tell you the kind of things that might happen that you can therefore hold in your head and think about. And
so they're assumptions.
They're assumption based. And, people have been trying to predict the future for as long as humans have existed. They kind of sacrifice goats and they just have to go and see the Delphic Oracle. And, particularly leaders have always tried to predict the future. Hence, Alexander the Great would go and consult the Oracle and beware the Ides of March and stuff to Caesar and all that. There's an immense human desire, particularly from leaders, to try and see into the future. That's why horoscopes are so big and everything. And there is no way of looking at predicting the future. You can predict, reasonably well to within a few minutes or a few days. People try and predict the weather, they try and predict that. But actually, mathematical models are not yet in any way able to predict things that depend on even semi-chaotic systems. A chaotic system is where the errors amplify the further away you get from where you are now. So the weather, the reason that even with the most powerful computers on the planet, you can't predict the weather more than 3, 4, 5 days, is that even if you had perfect measurement of every variable on day X, any errors anywhere or anything failed to, compound and mix and magnify so that I think when the Met Office, I don't remember what the number was, they invested 350 million on a new computer, and they basically said it would mean that the 4-day forecast would become about as accurate as the 3-day one had been before.
Yeah.
So that's the level of achievement. And beyond sort of 5 or 6 days, you can't. And anything that depends on, it's like stock markets. You've got the most money on the planet devoted to try and develop algorithms that can predict the future of the stock market. Some of the best hedge funds in the world kind of think they can therefore get an advantage by predicting where the market will go for about 30 milliseconds. Okay, I mean, just think about that. So less than a second. Now, that's because it's human behavior, people doing that. And these models that they're using for this are really no more accurate than that. They're kind of useful. They say, okay, if the maximum it could be like this and the minimum it could be like that, they're kind of useful. But they're not really. Epidemiology was not until recently about models. It was about useful things like, how does this virus spread? Who is most affected? A secondary attack rate is useful. It's more useful than an R number.
When did modelling become in vogue? And do you think it's been overused during this pandemic? I know we've been leading. Our countries are leads the way in modelling, doesn't it? And has influenced large parts of the rest of the world with its models of the virus spread.
Viruses are not predictable by models. They just aren't. They aren't.
Isn't there the grain of sand? If you add, it's the exponential rise.
It doesn't even follow an exponential. No. Biological processes follow a logistics function. Particularly a Gompertz function, not an exponential function. They never do. And the reason that biological things do is a mixture of running out of food, and also because of there's factors that make the acceleration fastest at the beginning. Yeah,
and then it sort of slows down.
But be that as may, even if you put a Gompertz function over it as opposed to those silly exponential.
And a Gompertz is just a rise and then a fall, a natural rise and falls.
The Gompertz function basically says that the fastest growth will be near the beginning, and will always start to fall once that peak of growth has been reached.
Getting to 70 miles an hour, you get a lot of
the acceleration gets slower, and without getting technical on it, that many biological processes follow this. If you look at the rate of growth of a reproduction of bacteria or viruses, they follow Gompertz function just in a petri dish or whatever, and populations kind of follow it, sort of. And if you've got a set of resources, but even if you had that, you still wouldn't know what numbers to put into it, because that would be assumption based, and they change all the time and they vary, and you can't do it. So it's like, as in finance or in life insurance, models are kind of useful so you can get some idea of the parameters. The 2008 financial crisis was, I wouldn't say it was entirely down to financial models, but probably 99.5%.
Really?
Yeah, because the models were based on assumptions that were just wrong. So the models, it was a bunch of financial models that showed that the packages of high-risk mortgages were safe. They were financial models that were presented to the rating agencies. The ratings agencies evaluated the models. The regulatory authorities signed off on the models. The SEC, the FSA, and all the others, they signed on the model. It was a model-based crisis.
So garbage in, garbage out. Yeah.
It's abuse of one tool. Epidemiology always was more about the medicine. Say, what is this disease? How is it transmitted? What causes it?
Things that we know, things that we can't predict the season. So the virus is a seasonal virus. So if you think we can rely on a model, we can't predict what the weather's going to be like, nor can we predict vaccine uptake, loads of other variables that you can't put into the model. So whatever way you cut it, it can't be a good basis for making predictions. But anyway, yes.
And if you happen to be someone who was right with your model,
you're lucky.
You weren't clever, you were lucky. It's the monkeys tossing coin type.
So why do you think we have relied on that? And do you think there's a shift away from this? I mean, do you think the government's moving away? We had the predictions that we'd have 200,000 people would die if we opened up in the summer, and there were calls from leading scientists to lock down again. We didn't do that. And I think you sort of were one of the vocal people saying, that wouldn't be a good idea because it's summer, it's a good time to open and all that. So we didn't see 200,000 deaths. We've seen falling cases. Do you think there will be a shift away from this reliance on model data? Do you see a change in the political mood?
Well, we'll see, won't we? I mean, all the evidence, as I referred to it earlier so far, is that it's very mild. I think Sajid Javid said to the House of Commons that out of these 336 cases identified so far, not one of them had been hospitalised. So, one hopes that there is more rationality creeping in. I think that the change of personnel in the cabinet has somewhat increased the number of people who are reasonably competent at analysing data as opposed to being bamboozled by experts. There is, I think that Matt Hancock, for all his qualities, was not really capable of looking at the hard data and facts and analysing them for himself, and hence was very much guided by these experts who were just futurologists, really, not epidemiologists. Astrology would be a good comparison. And now with Javid and some of the other changes, I feel I think we've got a stronger education minister now who will stand up more for education. I think Gavin Williamson, very nice chap, but didn't really make a stand about the harms being caused in education. So I think, in the education minister, the health minister, obviously got Rishi Sunak, who also understands data. I think we've got a higher number of people who will try to assess the situation more rationally and perhaps give more credence to the immense damage and downsides
and the real world data
and real world data than before. But
is it not, we've talked before, haven't we, about the precautionary principle and to act and to close borders because of the threat of a new variant? I mean, what do you think of that?
Yes, I think the precautionary principle is a much bigger threat to humankind than COVID or even most epidemics, because it is so beguiling in its attraction, especially in a world where people perhaps are more fearful of disease and more worried about their health than in past time. And the precautionary principle, which basically says, let's look at the worst case scenario and prepare for that so that we are well prepared for this eventuality. It sounds so credible. Oh my God, we should be prepared for the asteroid strike and the lightning strike and the fact that an epidemic may come. But if you take it to its logical conclusion and you say, okay, we will do everything just in case of the worst case scenario, just imagine, you would say, what's the worst case scenario if I get in my car? It could be I drive out the end of my drive and get hit by a lunatic driving a lorry at 100 miles an hour. If I were to go swimming in the sea, the worst case scenario is I get caught in a rip and I would drown. If I go out to a crowded place, the worst thing that happens is I could suffer from serious disease. If I go to a restaurant, I might be the one person that gets the kind of fatal food poisoning. And life would come to a standstill. And, this has been a pervasive thing in, the civil service and elsewhere and, across a lot of Western society, more and more use of this precautionary principle.
Do you think how has it played out in our response to this, and particularly with the variants?
I think it's exactly the case that the worst case scenario is the one that gets the headline. Dare I criticise your profession, the media? The scariest model, the worst case scenario generates the most headlines, and so this could happen. 200,000 deaths in. I mean, it was impossible. There could be 200,000 deaths in the summer. Impossible. It was mathematically, epidemiologically impossible.
200,000 deaths from
COVID. Over this summer. Those lunatics were predicting if we reopen. Of course, we reopened fully, and there was deaths actually fell, as you said. But the worst case scenario generator, and so prepare for the worst case scenario, and then if it turns out better, we'll all be okay, ignoring the immense damage of preparing for the worst case scenario. And of course, in many cases, you can see that the modern push for health and safety can make things worse, not better. We see now, sort of one of the worst seasons of respiratory viruses, non-COVID respiratory viruses, for many years, because 2 years people not catching any sorts of infection. Similarly, even a
Particularly-
basic thing like, like food poisoning, with far higher standards in supermarkets, restaurants and others, so people get far fewer cases of food poisoning. But if you're 85 and you now are unlucky enough to get food poisoning, you may die. Whereas 30 years ago, there was so much, or certainly 100 years ago, so much, bad food that an 85-year-old would probably be being exposed to these kind of viruses and bacteria that would cause people every day and not actually feeling any ill effects. It's like if you go to another country, you go to other countries, you may get sick, but the people who live there are not getting sick because they're exposed to those things every day.
Yeah.
And, these things have to be weighed against each other. But we now know that hygiene is almost certainly plays a big part in the amount of allergies that we're seeing and asthma and various other things. That the absence of kind of varied bacteria in the gut is behind many diseases. Interestingly, the best predictor of bad COVID outcomes, the second best predictor of bad COVID outcome, the second best is the frailty score, which is the score used to assess people's life expectancy, short-term life expectancy when they're very old. You do a frailty score. There's lots of stuff written, lots of studies done on it, and in terms of care homes.
I think Chris Whitty wanted to use that right at the beginning. Didn't
so that is the second best.
Yeah.
The best, which has only appeared in a few papers, is the composition of the gut bacteria, disruption to gut bacteria, which is very linked and has been known to be linked to your frailty score for a long time. There's actually a slightly better correlation than frailty score, which is incredible. But, again, that's the thing that we now know more and more of, that actually depriving people of the right sort of mix and bacteria into the gut has these huge effects, mentally, physically. Extraordinary how many things are now being put down to, apparently, what is it? 90% of the serotonin is produced in the gut. Anyway, the precautionary principle and the kind of move towards ever increasing amounts of safety, no matter what, worst case scenario, prepare for it. You might fall down the stairs tomorrow. You might drown in that swimming pool tomorrow. You might do that tomorrow. I think is a very big danger, and it's been a terrible thing in this crisis that the worst case scenario has dominated the headlines and dominated the thinking of government, because it sounds so scary if we don't do anything.
And journalists have
deaths.
Played their part, and that's the loop, and then governments respond. And do you think that's partly because the pandemic response has been driven by the biomedical community, whose training is in the precautionary principle? So if you go to the doctor and there's a lump, they have to then check it out and say, well, it could be cancer. Whereas, if you've got all the other disciplines there and all the other people from different sort of groups, you have a worst case scenario in education if you close the schools, if that's not reflected. Do you see what I mean? It's the biomedical community that's...
and this is a recent thing, though. I mean, until not very long ago, doctors didn't cure that much. So you didn't go. And pre-antibiotics, the number of things that you could go to a doctor with and get cured was quite low. I mean, it's one of the reasons antibiotic prescription took off so much, so fast, is that, you could go with all sorts of things and the doctor might know what you'd got, but they couldn't do anything about it. You had a bacterial infection. They couldn't actually do anything about it. You know, keep warm, tuck up, drink lots of water. And people didn't go to doctors necessarily expecting to be cured, because it didn't happen very often. Doctors were respected and they tried all sorts of things. But the truth was there was no massive expectation of perfect health. And if you went back to the primitive societies, you had a lump, you live with a lump, you might die, you didn't know, So it's a relatively recent thing in human thinking, that the expectation that diseases should be caught and prevented and all the rest of it. And with it has, come this precautionary principle, if in doubt, fix it. And we know that, for example, a lot of the, scanning, what do you call it, screening, actually causes more harm than good. In Sweden, that huge study of
breast cancer,
and that actually sort of more damage was done to lives than was prevented,
because
by the
interventions were made when they needed to be.
And almost certainly the same in prostate cancer recent times. So there's a lot of dangers to the precautionary principle, and I think it cannot it cannot be allowed really to become too pervasive. There's a place for it, but it's not everywhere and every day.
No.